Greetings and welcome to another exciting lecture in geomorphology. We're back again for another discussion about rivers and fluvial geomorphology. So we've been learning a lot about kind of fluvial hydraulics, the basics of how we quantify stream flow and the different measures of thinking about how much water's in a river, using the concept of discharge, thinking about the shear stresses that the water puts on the base of the stream and whether you'll be able to train sediment. So that's how we started this. We moved from there to think about channel form, the different types of channels there are out there. Now we're going to look at a little bit of an application and management of rivers, looking at some big rivers today. So today we're going to be talking about the Mississippi River system, and specifically we'll think about big floods on the Mississippi and how we control those big floods. So that's our plan for today. Our next lecture, we'll be thinking a little bit more about river restoration on a smaller scale with small rivers like the Walla Walla River. But for today, I want to think big rivers, big floods. That's what we're going to be doing today, looking at the Mississippi River, and the Atchafalaya River, which is a distributary system of the Mississippi in Louisiana. So before we jump into the Atchafalaya and talking about the reading that you did from John McPhee, I just want to talk about big floods on the Mississippi. And so the pictures that you're looking at right here, these are from the 1993 Mississippi River flood, which was a very, very large flood on the Mississippi River that cost hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. It's kind of back a little bit in our memory at this point, and there have been more recent floods as well on the Mississippi River. The big Mississippi floods of 2019 come to mind. So this appears to be a periodic event, this large-scale flooding, and potentially associated with climate change, something that we'll be seeing more of in the future. So let's take a look in at the Mississippi River and flooding first, and then from there we'll go on and talk about this Atchafalaya right here, tributary stream of the Mississippi River. But first, let's do the big picture. All right, is everyone ready? Let's jump in then. Okay, so the Mississippi River is the largest drainage basin in the United States. It drains much of the middle of the country, and there are many tributaries of the Mississippi River within this green area. And I want to note that for much of this, we're talking about a relatively humid climate here in the east and into the Midwest. And, there's a drier climate up here, in the headwaters of the Yellowstone River. But this is a relatively wet drainage basin. So we get quite a bit of moisture here, and thus we can end up with some big floods on the Mississippi River. Now, we talked about flood hydrographs earlier in the semester, and we talked about kind of flashy floods associated with like a peak discharge in a storm, where we might have a flash flood that occurs over a matter of minutes or hours. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about big massive floods. We're going to have a lot of water draining slowly through the Mississippi River drainage system. So these are floods that can take several weeks in terms of their flood crest before the flood crests go back down. And so generally these big floods are associated with abnormally wet conditions. Let's look at here at the how abnormal things were back in that 1993 river flood. So what we're looking at here on our x-axis is time, starting in 1992 and going up to 1993. And we're looking at precipitation amount in inches on that y-axis. Okay, so this is amount of precipitation in the upper Mississippi River basin. What we're looking at are two bars here. We're looking at these brown bars, which are the average amounts we expect in any given month, and then what was observed in this 1992-93 year. So here we're looking at July, month 7, 1992. We expect to get about 4 inches of rain. We got about 6 inches. Moving into August and September, a little bit less. And then look what happens here as we move into November of 1992. We'd expect really to get 2 inches of rain. We got 6 inches. And then as we move into the rest of the year, as we move into 1993, look at the conditions as we move into April, May, June, July, and August. we have month after month of significantly increased values of precipitation. When we should be getting 4 inches, we're getting 6 inches of rain. And that's spread out over the entire upper Mississippi River Basin. So what happens is our soils are absolutely saturated. Soils are completely saturated. And so we have saturation excess overland flow over basically the upper Mississippi River drainage basin. The whole basin is saturated. And so when you have these massive rainfall amounts here, the only place for that water to go is into the tributaries and down into the Mississippi River. So what we're looking at here are some comparative values here of rainfall for the Mississippi River Basin. Okay, so 19 up here on our first graph, we're looking at precipitation anomalies. 1955, 1950 to 1955. This is our long-term average. Oh, hold on one sec. We're going to pause this. Okay, and we're back. Sorry about that. Okay, so as I was talking about here, these the upper left of the screen, these are our kind of our long-term values for average precipitation throughout the Midwest here. What I want you to look at is just these relative colors here, kind of average conditions, where the greens and yellows are kind of average precipitation over this region. And what we want to compare that to is what we're going to be looking at here for our precipitation anomalies in 1993. And what I want you to look at how anomalously wet. The deeper blue the bar, the more wet these are. Look at these anomalously wet conditions. And again, it's not just 1 or 2 counties, but it's the entire upper Mississippi River drainage basin that is about as wet as you can see. It's as anomalously wet as you could possibly be. And so that's what happens in the upper Midwest during this really, really big precipitation event. And so when you add this together, a huge drainage basin, largest drainage basin in the United States, add with that with unusually wet conditions over that entire drainage basin, we end up with this. So what we're looking at here is what the Mississippi River at the confluence with the Missouri, and the Illinois River. This is what things normally look like. Okay, right? So here's the Missouri, Mississippi, and the Illinois River all coming together just north of St. Louis here. Here's what the Mississippi River looked like in 1993. So again, here's the Mississippi River right here. Look at the scale bar. This scale bar here, we're looking at kilometers. We're talking about a river that is essentially opened and is several kilometers wide. So just a massive, massive flood on the Mississippi River. We talked about meandering channels like this developing natural levees that then humans go and build up. If we look at the Mississippi River flood, first I want to look at on this side the levees and the number of levees that failed. So here we are going from St. Paul down the Mississippi River system, St. Louis, Kansas City, Nebraska. So these are the number of levees and the number of levees that failed. And so here we have federal versus non-federal. And we're talking about, in the case of Kansas City, basically every single levee failed. So all the levees are being overtopped. Water is dumping out over the sides, making that huge, huge channel. So here we're looking at the discharge of the Mississippi River in St. Louis, that last picture. So in that anomalously wet time period before, we're talking about a discharge of about 600,000 CFS. And then as we creep up into the flood of 1993, we're looking at 1 million CFS for the discharge of this river. 1 million CFS. Peak discharge was 1,080,000 cubic feet per second in St. Louis, Missouri. Just a huge river, huge flood, huge discharges that overtopped the levees, causing massive amounts of flooding. So here's what downtown St. Louis looked like during the flood. Just water everywhere. The main channel is over here. Okay. All right, there was a lot of damage caused by this. These types of large floods cause lots and lots of damage. So here we're looking at agricultural damage. And so agricultural damage in the upper Mississippi River Basin, The darker the colors, the more money that damage caused. And so we're looking at here damaged acres. And so the dark green bars, each county has over 100,000 acres of damage. And what we're looking at in the red here is damage in terms of dollars. And every red here is equal to $50 million in damage. So lots and lots of lost agricultural crops due to the big flooding, essentially flooding all these fields and losing crops for the year. We also saw massive commercial damage. Each one of these blue dots here is $10 million in damage, and that's just commercial. And then we've got all the people building along the floodplain as well, and so we have residential damage. Each one of these red dots here is over $5 million in damage. So again, hundreds of millions of dollars in damage when you average out across all these sectors caused by these floods. So these floods are really, really big, and they can be very, very damaging, and they can also be very threatening to humans as well, people that get swept up in these as well. Okay, and these floods transport a lot of sediment with them too. And so where does all that sediment end up? It ends up down in the Gulf of Mexico in the Mississippi River Delta. So deltas are where we have rivers that either enter a stream or a lake, and you go from a high energy stream to essentially a zero energy lake in terms of water velocity. And so the shear stress of the river drops to near zero, and so the river can no longer transport the load, and so it dumps out, build your delta. And so here is the delta for the Mississippi River. So this is the main channel of the Mississippi, but here at the end of a river system, you end up with what's called the distributary system, where you have multiple channels where you've got water flowing out, and each one of these channels is carrying sediment that dumps out, forming a delta. So basically here, the delta for this delta here in southern Louisiana, the lower half of Louisiana is essentially a big delta, and then this distributary network takes the sediment farther and farther out into the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so here's just a picture showing essentially the current delta and distributary system of the Mississippi River, but we also have what we can see here in this image of sediment from other rivers and other distributaries that is dumping out as well. And so we see that actually the Mississippi River, the lower Mississippi River is in Louisiana is a series of deltas. Let me restate that. The lower half of the state of Louisiana is essentially a series of deltas of the Mississippi River as it's flopping back and forth across lower Louisiana. And so one of these in particular is the Atchafalaya. So here's the Mississippi River and its course as it flows today by New Orleans and then out that distributary network. The Atchafalaya is another distributary of the Mississippi that dumps out in the Mississippi over here today. So this is going to be our area of interest for our story today and the control of nature, which is right there, that distributary corner where the Atchafalaya and the Mississippi, where the Mississippi goes in one direction and the Atchafalaya goes off on the. Okay. So the current Mississippi River Delta is essentially at the edge of the continental shelf. So here we've got the Mississippi River Delta right here, and then right here is the edge of the shelf. And so the Mississippi River has prograded out onto the shelf about as far as it can, and it'll eventually flip and dump sediment out. Now what this means is that we have an incredibly long river profile right now. The course of the river that it takes out to the ocean is very, very long, and so it has a very, very low slope. And so because of that, if the Mississippi River can find a shorter path to the ocean, it's going to want to take that path. It's going to want to maximize its energy loss so that it dumps out more quickly. And so streams seek to maximize efficiency, and this is the same reason why eventually meander necks will get cut across as streams try to straighten and find those steeper routes. And so here, if you've got a stream that's flowing along a really long path like the Mississippi River is today, that's going to, if the stream can find a shorter path to the ocean with a steeper slope, it's going to dump down that steeper slope. So right here, that's what's happening right at the confluence of the Mississippi and the Atchafalaya. And that also explains why deltas flip back and forth and you create big, broad, flat deltas. So here are the 7 deltas that we've had across the Mississippi River in southern Louisiana in the past 5,000 years. So this is over time. 7,000 years ago, the Mississippi River Delta was over on the western portion of the state. Then it's moved over time to its current position all the way out here. And again, at this point, we've got a very, very long flow path that the river's taking. And so now we are in a potential where we could see the Mississippi River Delta, that main distributary network, switch to another part of the delta that has a steeper path. Does that make sense? Yeah, but there's a problem, right? Naturally, this is what the Mississippi River might do, but we've added a couple of things to this picture. We've built large settlements next to the current position of the Mississippi River, and so we have lots of infrastructure associated with shipping at the current path of the Mississippi River. So if the Mississippi River shifts over here, that's a problem for all the boats that have ports here in New Orleans. Okay, so that brings us to our fun problem here on the Mississippi River at the Atchafalaya. And right here, we've got the Mississippi River that just connects to the Atchafalaya River. How do I want to do this? Yeah, right here. Right here, we have that connection between the two, where a little bit of the water dumps out into the Atchafalaya, flows down the Atchafalaya River. Now, just a little bit does. And the concern is that the entire Mississippi wants to be flowing down this much shorter route to the sea. And so we've installed several control structures called the Old River Control Project, a bunch of engineering designs to essentially keep the water in the Mississippi River and out of the Atchafalaya River. So let's look at the geomorphology through time of the Atchafalaya Old River Control Structure. Or excuse me, the Atchafalaya and the Old River. Over 1,000 years ago, there was an even older distributary of the Mississippi River called the Red River. And so the Red River came from farther north, and it was a different channel than the Mississippi River. In the 15th century, the Mississippi River migrated into the Red River. And as it did so, the lower half of the Red River now becomes a distributary of the Mississippi River system, right? And so now what's happening is water from the main flow of the Mississippi is getting dumped down the Atchafalaya River. In 1881, there was a cutoff meander called Shreve's Cut that cut off this big meander bend right here. And so by 1950s, essentially, you've got 2 old river channels. One, I'm right in front of it, sorry. One here called Old River, and then one down here, Upper Old River and Lower Old River. So does this make sense where the names come from now? It's because previously, before Shreve's Cut, the Old River channel had this big bend in it, this big bend right here, okay? And so as we cut that meander neck, then we end up with essentially these old meander scars. And we call one on the top the Old Upper River, and the one on the bottom the Low Older River. The Low Older River was more open, and so you actually had boats that could go back and forth across the Old River. Now, what we've started to do since then is we've started to construct a series of control structures that keep the majority of the water in the Mississippi River. And so those consist of these overbank structures at the Upper Old River, and then some navigation locks and closures on the Lower Old River. And so currently this is what the system looks like today between the Old River and the Old River and the Atchafalaya River. In front of, no, okay, right. This is kind of 2010 today. So let's kind of look through a couple more diagrams of this here. So here's the Mississippi River coming down. There it goes. And then we have the upper Old River here, and we've got an overbank control structure that allows us to block the water from going into the old channel. Then we have down here on this side, we have a series of navigation locks that we can control water going in and out, but we can still move boats down the old river and into the Atchafalaya. Okay, so let's look at what these look like. So here we're looking down the Mississippi River. So here you would be going down the Mississippi River, okay? And so this is that upper Old River control structure right here, and then the lower river control structure down there. Okay. Here's what these things look like. So essentially these are, they don't look like much. It's really flat down here, but this is a lot of water. And so essentially these are big kind of almost like levees that block the channel and allow us to precisely control the amount of water in the Mississippi River. And you can see the barge here behind my shoulder, right? Oh, there it is. Got that barge right there as a shipping traffic. And so these structures allow us to keep the water in the Mississippi River. Now, right here, this is really important, this overbank control structure. See how there's a little white water here? There's actually a difference in the elevation of the river right here. It's actually it's about 5 feet lower on this side. And so we're actually able to actually have a little power plant on this and generate power as water pushes over the control structure and pumps a turbine. So again, 5 feet difference here. So that's important, right? Because if we didn't have a structure here, then more of the Mississippi River water would flow down this structure. All right, here we have again these structures. So we've got the Red River coming in. Oh, there we go, Red River coming in here. Then we have our distributary with the Atchafalaya River now associated with these old river control structures. Here's that power plant again, water going down. Got all the way down here. We've got that the navigation lock where ships can move Atchafalaya in the Mississippi. Let's take a Google Earth tour to see what this looks like. It's not particularly exciting. It's very flat down here in Louisiana, but this is just an image from the Google car looking across, and we're on the bridge and looking essentially across that low sill structure into the old river channel, upper old river channel. Then the Atchafalaya would be back over there. A couple more pictures kind of showing what this looks like. And here's what the low sill structure looks like in the navigation lock on the lower Old River. So again, Mississippi River over here. Then right here, the navigation lock is where boats come in and out. Oop. There we go. Navigation lock right there. Okay, excellent. And then this is another low point where we built this sill, essentially a levee that protects the water from flowing up and over the old channel. All right, I want you to keep an eye out. This is what things look like at low flows. I want to show you next what this looks like at high flows. So keep an eye for these areas that I've circled and look how they change. Okay, so here we are. We're going to be looking at these structures on the old river, on the Mississippi River. Here we are at low flow, at a relatively low flow. And there's how these things flood at a higher flood. And so these pictures right here, this is just from Google Earth. This was from a relatively small flood in 2009. You kind of see the flood crest here. This is just the gauge height, river going up several feet associated with this. So again, at low flow, this doesn't look particularly exciting, but it's at high flow when these structures are stressed because you've got huge volumes of water. Remember, we're talking about during floods, 1 million cubic feet per second of water that are moving down these river systems. Okay, so the next I want to just read the quote for you from the 1970s flood that John McPhee describes in the book. So let's just read that next because I think it's delightful. So again, it's really tough to convey the enormity of what's going on here, right? These little control structures are all that are keeping the Mississippi River from dumping into the old river and then flowing down into the Red River. So yeah, the old Red River, the Atchafalaya. Okay, so here's the quote here. McGuire had built Old River Control to just about as much as was passing through it. In mid-March, when the volume began to approach that amount, curiosity got the best of Raphael G. Kasman, author of a book called Modern Hydrology, the professor of civil engineering professor of civil engineering at Louisiana State University. Kasman got into his car, crossed the Mississippi River on the High Bridge at Baton Rouge, and made his way north to Old River. He parked, got out, and began to walk the structure. An extremely low percentage of its 566 feet eradicated his curiosity. That whole miserable structure was vibrating, he recalled in 1986, adding that he had felt as if he were standing on a platform at a small rural train station when a fully loaded freight goes through. Kasman opted not to wait for the caboose. I thought, this thing weighs 200,000 tons. When 200,000 tons vibrates like this is no place for R.G. Kasman. I got into my car, turned around, and got the hell out of there. I was just a professor, and thank God, not responsible. So this is describing essentially what was happening in this 1973 flood on the Mississippi River. And so essentially this is where Kasman started to walk out onto this control structure. The whole thing is vibrating like you're at a train station as the freight train goes by. And again, it's hard to convey here the importance of this little thin strip of concrete. This is all that holds the Mississippi River from abandoning its current channel that will take the Mississippi by the city of New Orleans and entering a lower pathway, which is the Atchafalaya River. The Atchafalaya River is sitting 5 feet lower than the Mississippi. So if you're able to dump the Mississippi down in, it's going to erode and you're going to lose the majority of the flow into the Atchafalaya. And then the Mississippi River becomes a distributary of the Atchafalaya River. And so this is it. If this thing fails, then essentially New Orleans becomes a backwater and not the main water courseway for the Mississippi River. There was substantial scour on the Mississippi River at the structure. Oops, lost our video. Let me bring that back on. All right, and we're back. You can see it in red here where we had significant scour of the structure. And so that we were cutting underneath. And so this is common along rivers, is that when you have structures, you'll get scour along the base of them through vortex flow, and so you scour out the base. And so if this thing had failed, the whole thing would have collapsed. So I'll just got a little movie here to show you what scour can look like when you're scouring along a meander bend, which is essentially what happened in the Mississippi River here. I can write on the video. Hold on. All right, I guess I'll just add the video in on my own here when I edit this video. Sorry about that. So let's wait for a sec.
Joder. 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 No me jodas, tío. No me jodas, no me jodas, no me jodas.
Okay, you've watched the video. Highly exciting. Let's move on then. So this story, maybe it seems a little bit old to you, right? This story is flooding from the 1970s, the 1973 flood, and then I showed you the damage and the amount of flooding in the 1990, the 1993 flood on the Mississippi. But again, we saw significant flooding in 2019 and 2011 as well. And so what's really important here is thinking about, in terms of damage, the amount of time that these rivers are at flood stage, how that's changing over time. So here's some big floods on the Mississippi from the 20s, 70s, 2011, and 2019. And this is just the days that the river is above flood stage. And so days above flood stage. And so here in 2019, we're talking about 160 days that the river in Red River Landing in Louisiana was at flood stage. So again, we're talking about months and months of time when the river is at flood stage. And so when we think about how climate change is impacting large floods, we need to realize that we might see larger floods more frequently because of climate change. As we warm the atmosphere, we can pack more water into the atmosphere and rain more in the drainage basin. So here's just a protester here suggesting that those in the federal government wake up to climate change and that we need to understand how we manage these rivers moving forward when we are going to expect potentially larger floods. All right, that's all I've got for you on the Mississippi River. Thanks for watching. Have a great day and see you later. Bye.